Hello again and welcome back to Projects Academy's Lean Six Sigma Green Belt Masters Series. And here we are in Module 1, the first of the DMAIC Improve phase. So without much ado, let me first of all set the scene for you on what the main elements are of the Improve phase. As you can see, the topics we'll cover here will be on lateral thinking and random stimulus. Here's your diagram, which you're now familiar with, I'm sure. And here we are at the Improve phase. Previously, as you know, we'd spent a lot of time analysing. Quite a lot of maths in that, wasn't there, if you remember, where we were identifying the cause of the problem. And that meant in Analyse phase, we had to spend a bit of time pinpointing and verifying the causes that affect the key input and output variables within your process. However, here in the Improve phase, we'll take that information from Analyse and implement and verify the solution. So put very simply, the key steps here will be to develop potential solutions using the data we've obtained from the Analyse phase, and then to evaluate, select and optimize the best solution. So one of the characteristics you'll notice in the Improve phase versus the previous Analyse phase is that here we'll be using a lot more practical approaches to actually implement your improvement project. And as you can see, this is the second to last phase, the final one being the control phase. Much more of that later. So let's make a start in the Improve phase by looking at a very well-known gentleman, Dr. Edward de Bono, who hailed from Malta, and it was he who came up with the term lateral thinking. And you'll see exactly how that applies to the Improve phase. You see, creative thinking, to quote Dr. Edward de Bono, is a skill and is not, in fact, just a matter of individual talent. In other words, you can train and coach yourself to become better at creative thinking. However, be careful about creative thinking. It's not just wild idea generation of its own, although that too has its place. Your new creative idea must have some value rather than just being different for the sake of being different. We're all probably familiar with the left and right hand side of the brain, where the left hand side is where you have your more logical and mathematical side, if you will, and the right hand side is the more creative side of your brain. And the brain, just like for example a muscle, needs to be exercised to use its full potential. And I'm afraid the society we're in, whether we like it or not, people are reluctant to be creative within organisations, because if you try an idea and it doesn't work, that is regarded as a mistake, a rather negative connotation. In fact, I'm a great fan of Elon Musk and his fantastic endeavours, both in space, the car industry and other projects, where he takes the view in his organisation that if you're not making mistakes, you're not innovating enough. However, people don't like failures and mistakes, as they may impact their promotion and career. So in many modern organisations, mistakes are still seen as bad. So in our normal logical thinking, that's the left-hand side of your brain, you can only say things which make sense to yourself and fits with what you have done and said before. That's normal logical thinking. However, and here's a direct quote, studies show that 90% of error in thinking is due to an error in perception. And what we're about to see is that by changing your perception, this will change your emotion, which in turn will lead to new ideas. So relying just on the left-hand side of our brain, you'll find that logic will never change emotion or perception. So how do we break out of this? Well, there's several approaches, and let me start with provocation. This is a method of lateral thinking which is completely contrary to logical thinking, putting us in a different position in our patterning system, allowing us to be open to new ideas. So lateral thinking, also known as thinking outside the box, like this gentleman here, you see, we are all within a certain box formed by the constraints, by our expectations, by the concepts we use, and by the perceptions we use, and we play around only inside that box. The trick, therefore, is to get you thinking out of the box. So thinking outside the box means breaking out of the box to change concepts, change perceptions, change constraints, change rules, etc., and in doing so, develop new ideas. So lateral thinking is a way of thinking which seeks the solution to intractable problems through unorthodox methods or elements which would normally be ignored by logical thinking. I can remember, decades ago now, when I was on a lateral thinking course. And in it, we were split into groups, and each group had to design a perfect garden shed or a recreation area for their garden. And each group was given a different thought to help come up with new ideas. And our group was told, design a doghouse. Now, these don't tend to be so commonly used these days. I have a dog, and he lives with us in our house. But back then, having a nice little doghouse where your dog could remain safe and comfortable, often throughout the night, was a more common concept. So our brief was to build the perfect doghouse, and then having come up with all of the features and facilities our pet would have, we were then told, now apply as many of those ideas as you can to building the perfect recreation area in your garden for us humans. So, lateral thinking is very much defined in system terms, moving across from the main pattern to a side pattern, which once you're there, in hindsight, you can link up with your starting point. Now that may not make too much sense right now, but stay with me here. You see, thinking outside the box is a general term meaning unusual ideas which would not have arisen within your box of your usual thinking. Going back to the idea of designing features for a doghouse, one of the things we came up with was an automatic refillable water bowl. Not so unusual these days, but back then it wasn't. And then when we applied it to our recreation centre, we started thinking about installing a drinks cabinet and so on and so forth. So there are three key, let me call them techniques or approaches that will help you get into the lateral thinking mindset. The first is called random stimulus, another is association, and the third is out-of-the-box ideas. Here you can see in my little graphic, linear or traditional thinking sees a problem that you need to solve. You look straight at the problem and you have to think through to get some idea of a solution. Whereas lateral thinking allows you not only to, of course, go straight ahead as above, but also, just as a concept approach here, you can go around the edges as well, and that will allow you to glimpse new ideas that you wouldn't have thought of if you'd have just stared at the wall, if you will, the rock in the road, as Americans like to say. So let's start with the first, random stimulus. Fairly obvious, is a technique where a random word or a random image or an action or even a sound is used to open a new line of thinking. So each unrelated idea, much like the doghouse, is used to derive relative associations to a problem that we have on hand. So it starts with the problem, which you cannot solve, or that you want to create out-of-the-box ideas to resolve that problem. Then you pick, in this case, a random stimulus. It could be a sound, an action, or an image. And then you start forming associations between your problem and the random stimulus. Now you might get multiple ideas that can be further refined, providing a stream of out-of-the-box ideas. So keeping with random stimulus, the first idea is to use a random word. Now, just as an example here, and something that I'm fairly familiar with, let's assume that you work for a company that manufactures electronic boards, and that you have a problem where you have defective wiring or soldering leading to faults when testing, and this leads, of course, ultimately, unfortunately, to customer complaints. Here's a typical electronic board that I'm familiar with, lots of different electronic components on it. It forms part of the inside of a product, and it therefore has to be linked and wired up to the box that it's sitting in with various controls, switches, knobs, and what have you. And the problem we had was defective wiring and soldering, since the PCBs were generally less open to human errors. So, in this case, you pick up a random word. And in this example, let's imagine it happens to be ingredient. Now, what association can you form between the problem you have, which is defective wiring and soldering? We use the word dry joints for that, meaning it wasn't a perfect electrical connection. And you have the word ingredient. Well, would you think of recipe and food? I certainly did. Being an enthusiastic yet amateur cook, you may think about the right mix of materials. Yes, I certainly would. Or ingredients, if you will. So here's some of the way in which the random word of ingredient, perhaps in the creation of a particular dish that you're preparing for your family tonight, you've first of all got the recipe, which is the right mix of materials, the food of course. So you're looking for a product free from defects as per the customer's needs. When it comes to the part, less moving parts and highly durable. Well, it's a bit of a stretch for making food, but just think about it. Some fairly simple English dishes, like Yorkshire puddings, have to be very carefully brought together. The right temperature, the right mix and approach and everything else. Then you've got lists, all of the standard operating procedures in front of employees. So you can see immediately how this would go back to the folks you're using to assemble these boards. In terms of a recipe for food, this would be a list that complies first of all with the recipe itself, plus all of the techniques you may be using. And then of course finally cooking. And the way in which you would cook or prepare this dish of food would depend on what it is the customers or the folks who are going to eat it actually want. So can you start to see here that by using a recipe for food and using these elements here, you could then say, how does that relate to my problem of wiring and soldering faults? Sticking with random, what about random image? Something I attempted again at least a decade ago was deciding, as I live here in Spain, wouldn't it be good to learn to play golf? Well, that didn't last too long. I found out how frustrating the game was and not for me, but let's just stick with the idea of random stimulus. There it is, a golfer. Now, what do we have here? Well, the discipline involved playing golf. And how could we relate that back to our faulty wiring and soldering? Well, in the game of golf, you build a discipline to adherence of the way in which you play it, the rules of the game, all important critical approach when you're taking your shot and so on. So back in your workshop, build a discipline of adherence to standard operating procedures or adapting to a culture. Anyone who has attempted to play the game of golf will know that practice is key. You really can't get enough of it. However, getting back to our faulty boards, you could do lots of employee practice to employees before putting them on actual work. So there would be an idea. Get them on half days training, for example, connecting up the boards in front of an instructor that can help make sure that their knowledge and skills are up to the task. And in a game of golf, conviction. You've really got to stick at it. And going back to boards, build an interest to be the best as a company and as an employee. What about hierarchy? Well, out on the golf course, it's one person against the next person or group of people. So here, regarding construction of boards, hierarchy, you could be rating individuals based on their defect level and giving them challenge cups, just as you would in golf. That would be an interesting idea, wouldn't it? And using the Japanese term of sensei, have a few experienced engineers to audit, a bit like having your personal golf coach. So that's enough of the random image. Perhaps just pause and think for a moment. If you've got a particular problem that you're aware of at work, let's assume, think about choosing a random image, nothing to do with the problem you've got at hand, and see if you can, by looking at that image, thinking about the situation, tie back to the problem you're thinking of. The last random stimulus or stimuli is random sound, not so often thought about. And this can be a more complex approach to generate ideas. Maybe more about adapting emotions to actions. It could be listening to what you consider relaxing music and letting your subconscious brain evolve ideas. Something I learned, I remember back in my school days, I was often disciplined because I was staring out of windows. Stop daydreaming, Lytton, they would say, and I saw it as a bad thing. Later in my adult life, I could see that 5, 10, 15 minutes of staring out of the window, so to speak, giving your creative mind full rein to creative ideas is a good way to do it. And if you have a particular style of music, let's say, that you quite enjoy, then listening to that, letting your subconscious mind move in different directions, can be a very powerful technique. So there we have it. A nice easy start, looking at the work done by Dr. Edward de Bono and the ability to use random stimulus to the generation of such ideas. However, we've just scratched the surface. So in the next module, module 2, we'll continue looking at lateral thinking and brainstorming. Thanks for your time, thanks for your attention. Until we meet up again, from me, Dave, it's bye for now.